The cabin is small. The wind off the Tanana River, deep in the interior of Alaska, is cold even in summer. And in November of 2011, when the team led by Ben Potter from the University of Alaska Fairbanks reaches the deepest pit at a site called Upward Sun River. The cold is the kind that gets inside the seams of the canvas tent and stays there. They are not expecting much that day. They have been working the site for years. They have already found one infant burial, a child laid down with red ochre and stone tools, much like the Anzac boy in Montana. And they have already extracted some of the rarest, oldest, most fragile material in the archaeology of the Americas. Then, a few centimeters deeper, a second small body. Another infant, a fetus almost. The two children appear to have been buried in the same fire pit, possibly in the same season, and the dating runs that follow will place them at roughly 11,500 years before the present. They are, between them, two of the oldest human remains anywhere in the Americas with sequenced DNA. And inside the mouth of one of them, surviving the 11 millennia of permafrost cycles and stream erosion and bear trampling that the site has endured, sits a single, perfectly preserved tooth. That tooth is going to change everything. The site itself sits in a place that should be inhospitable to anyone trying to build a life. The Tanana River cuts through a long valley between the Alaska Range to the south and the Yukon-Tanana uplands to the north. In the late Pleistocene, the climate was even harsher than today. The Mammoth Steppe stretched across what is now Alaska and into Siberia. Mosquitoes and biting flies were a torment in summer. Winter dropped temperatures that turned exposed skin black in minutes. And yet, 11,500 years ago, a small community came here, set up a structure with a hearth, hunted hares and salmon, and lived long enough for two of their children to be born and to die. The site had been excavated since 2006. The Healy Lake tribe, on whose traditional territory the work is being done, is closely involved. Permissions are negotiated. Findings are shared. The first infant, given the Middle Tanana Athabascan name Zachite Anen Tiidagai, meaning Sunrise Girl Child, is recovered in 2010. Her DNA is extracted slowly, with the kind of patience that ancient DNA work demands. By the time the team is ready to publish, in early 2018, they have something to say that no one had anticipated. The genome of the Sunrise Girl Child does not fit into either of the two existing major branches of Native American ancestry. The Southern Native American lineage, represented by the Anzac child, or the Northern Native American lineage, represented by various Algonquian and Athabascan-speaking populations. Instead, the Sunrise Girl Child belongs to a third branch, one that diverged from the others earlier and stayed put. The team, led by Potter and the molecular biologist S.K. Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, names this third branch the Ancient Beringians. The paper appears in Nature on January 3rd of 2018. Here is what that means. Simplified. Imagine a population, call them the Beringian Standstill people, sitting at the edge of the New World, in the long pause that paleogenomicists have argued for since the early 2000s. The standstill, depending on the model, lasted anywhere from a few thousand to 10,000 years. Then, somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, the population began to split. Some of them moved south, eventually giving rise to all the lineages now found from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. But a fraction of them did not move south. They stayed in Beringia. They lived there for thousands of years, and the Sunrise Girl Child is their representative in the genetic record. Her ancestors had been on that continent for longer than any other group whose DNA we have read. And yet her lineage, the ancient Beringians, left no major modern descendants. They are, by the time of European contact, essentially gone. Replaced, intermixed, vanished. This is a population we did not know existed before that tooth was sequenced. Think about that for a moment. A whole lineage of human beings, distinct enough genetically to constitute a third major branch of New World ancestry, lived in Beringia for thousands of years, raised children, buried their dead with ochre and stone tools, and then disappeared without leaving a clear line of descent into any modern indigenous community. Their archaeological footprint is so sparse that we only began to recognize it because of one tooth in one mouth, in one infant in one fire pit on one bend of the Tanana River. If the team had stopped digging 6 inches above where they did, we would not know they had ever lived. The implications spiral outward from there. The 2 main branches of Native American ancestry, the northern and the southern, split, the data now suggest, around 15,000 years ago, only after the ancient Beringians had already gone their own way. The standstill then was not a brief pause. It was a long residency, during which an early founding population diversified in place before any of its branches moved south. The peopling of the Americas, in this revised picture, was not a sprint of a few hundred years. It was a slow, layered, several millennia process, beginning with a population pausing for a very long time, splitting first into a stay-behind branch, the ancient Beringians, and a move-on branch, the ancestors of every other Native American group, and then splitting again, much later, into the north and south lines that produce the broad indigenous geography we know today. The Anzac child in Montana, then, is a piece of this puzzle. The Kennewick man in Washington is another. The Sunrise Girl child in Alaska is the deepest in time and the most surprising, because she belongs to a lineage that, in genetic terms, was already its own thing before either of the other 2 existed. What the tooth could tell us, beyond lineage, is a kind of human portrait. The Sunrise Girl child died at about 6 weeks old. Her companion, in the pit, sometimes called by the family the Yekanenchtiidagai, or Dawn Twilight child, was even younger, almost certainly stillborn, or dying shortly after birth. Both were buried with care. Stone tools, ochre, the structure of the pit itself, all of it spoke to a community grieving. The Healy Lake tribe and the wider Tanana Chiefs Conference has been clear that these are children of their ancestors and that their dignity in life and in death deserves the kind of respect they would have received 11 millennia ago. The work was done with consent. The story was told with consent. The names were given with consent. And when the press releases came out in early 2018, the language emphasized, perhaps for the first time, so clearly in this field, that the science was a window into the deep past of indigenous peoples, not a discovery made about them by outside scientists. The framing matters. It has always mattered. It is finally being practiced. Here is the strange grandeur of the story. The first peoples of the Americas, the data are showing us, were not one wave. They were a population that lived for thousands of years in a place that no longer exists, Beringia, the great cold grassland between what is now Russia and Alaska, swallowed by the Pacific when the glaciers melted. And that population diversified in that home before any of them walked south. Then they walked south, then they diversified again. Then some of them walked all the way to the southern tip of South America, and all the while, a stay-behind group remained in the north, holding the original ground until their numbers dwindled and their lineage stopped being read in the cells of the living. A whole branch of humanity lost, living only in the DNA of 2 infants in a pit on a bend in the Tanana. The ancient Beringians teach us, more than anything, that the genetic record of the Americas is not symmetrical. It is not a complete inventory of every population that ever lived here. It is a thinned-out, accidental archive, preserved by permafrost, by limestone, by the rare gift of dry sand or anaerobic mud, and the populations whose remains did not happen to be preserved in those special conditions are simply absent. The Sunrise Girl child is here because the Tanana River froze her in time. Her contemporaries elsewhere in Beringia, the ones whose graves lie now under the cold Bering Sea, are gone. Their cells are dispersed in salt water. Their stories are not. What can we still recover? Probably more populations like the ancient Beringians, more branches we did not know existed. Probably more children, buried with stone and ochre, whose teeth survived the millennia. The work goes on. New permafrost sites are being identified across the Yukon and into Siberia. The DNA techniques get better every year. The cooperation between tribal communities and labs is, at its best, becoming a model for how this kind of science can be done with the people whose history is being read. But the Sunrise Girl child has already done the deepest work. She told us that the human story in the Americas began earlier and ran slower and forked more than the textbooks said. She told us that her lineage existed. She told us that not every branch of the human tree in the New World left descendants. She told us, without being able to say a single word, that the past is wider than the present. She was wrapped in the soil for 11,500 years. The fire pit her family dug for her was a circle of stones the size of a kitchen table. Above her, the Alaska Range climbed into clouds she would never have seen as anything but blurs of blue. The river ran the same direction it runs now. The sun rose in the east, named by her people for her, and set in the west. And in her tiny mouth, 11 millennia later, a single tooth held the genome of a vanished branch of the human family, ready to be read by anyone patient enough to listen. We listened, the lineage spoke, and the map of who was here, and when, and how, has not been the same since. Researchers in the years since have used the Sunrise Girl Child's genome as a kind of reference point for every new American sample that comes in. When a new ancient skeleton is sequenced anywhere in the New World, one of the first comparisons is with her. How closely does the new genome match the ancient Beringian profile? How does the divergence date stack up against the upward Sun River timeline? She has become a benchmark, a calibration point, an anchor. The child who lived 6 weeks is now one of the most referenced individuals in the entire field of American archaeogenetics. There is something almost unbearable about that asymmetry. A life so short, an afterlife so long. But the asymmetry is the gift she gave us. The brief existence preserved the bone preserved the tooth preserved the cells preserved the lineage. And the lineage, finally read in a quiet laboratory in Copenhagen, told us about a people we had never met. The story did not need her to live a long time. It only needed her to be loved and laid down, with care, in a place where the cold did the rest. Somewhere on the Tanana today, the river is still running. The hearth pit is filled in. The cabin is gone. The 2 infants are reburied, with permission and ceremony, where their descendants asked them to be. The tooth has done its work. The lineage has its name. And the textbook story of how the Americas were peopled, once a single line drawn down a corridor in the ice, is now a tree with branches we did not know to look for. One tooth, one genome, one vanished people, brought back into the long sentence of who we know was here.